When he died, 2 million people came to his funeral. The greatest writer in the history of France, the man who wrote Les Misérables, the voice of the poor, the defender of the wretched. But the diaries they found after his death told a different story. A story written in 3 languages in code in his own handwriting. 300 women, his servants, his friends' wives, the mother of his children's friends. The last entry was made on the day he died. He was 83 years old. He had a stroke that morning. The diary records a sexual encounter shortly before the stroke. What kind of a man was Victor Hugo? In 2010, in a small house on southwestern tip of England, an old man was preparing to move out. He was sorting through boxes in his attic, dust, forgotten papers, a 17-volume handwritten autobiography written by a 19th century British sculptor named Henry Simpson. Nobody had read it in over 100 years. The old man did not know what to do with it. He called it Tate Archive in London. They sent someone to look. They took the volumes away. The volumes sat on a shelf in the Tate basement for 9 more years. Then, in 2010, an activist named Adrian Glue opened them. And on one of those pages, buried in the memoirs of a forgotten English stonemason, he found a single sentence that solved a mystery that had haunted French literature for 129 years. The sentence described another stonemason, a Frenchman, working at Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris in 1820s. Nicknamed by his colleagues Le Bossu, the Hunchback. He worked under a carver named Trajan. He had a deformity of spine. He kept him to himself. He carved the gargoyles and the saints that still look down from a cathedral today. And he lived in the same neighborhood, walked the same streets, breathed the same Paris air as a young writer who between 1828 and 1831 was writing a novel. The young writer's name was Victor Hugo. The novel was Notre Dame's de Paris. The bell ringer was Quasimodo. For 2 centuries, the world believed Quasimodo was invented, a creature of pure imagination, a symbol. He was not. He was a real man whose name was lost, whose only trace in the historical record is a nickname in a forgotten Englishman's diary. But this is not his story. There is not enough of him left to tell one. This is the story of a man who watched him work, the man who saw the hunchback carver lifting a chisel against a saint and went back home and write a novel that will make him immortal. This is the story of Victor Hugo. And the man who wrote about pity, about deformity, about love that cannot be returned was not the man you think he was. He was a man who would, over the course of his life, do 3 things that nobody who reads Les Misérables would ever expect. The first one started with the death of his daughter. He was born in 1802. He was the son of a Napoleonic general. He grew up between Paris and Madrid and the battlefields of Europe. By the age of 20, he was already famous. By 30, he was the most important poet in France. By 40, he was the most important novelist. He married young, a childhood friend named Adèle Faucher. They had 5 children together. The oldest daughter was named Leopoldine. She was, by every account, the love of his life, not romantically, paternally. He wrote her into his poems. He carried her on his shoulders through the streets of Paris. He once wrote that she was the one face in which he saw God. In 1843, the Leopoldine was 19 years old. She married a young man named Charles Wackery. The wedding was small. The marriage was happy. 4 months later, in September of 1843, the young couple was sailing on the River Seine near a town called Villecoeur. The boat capsized. Leopoldine could not swim. Her dress, heavy with water, pulled her under. Her husband could swim. He was on the surface. He saw her go down. He dove. He could not reach her. He came back up. He went down again. He could not reach her. He came back up one last time, looked at the people on the shore, and made a decision. He went down a third time, and he did not come back up. He chose to drown with her rather than survive her. Their bodies were found together, her arms around him, his arms around her. They were buried in the same grave. Victor Hugo was traveling at the time. He was in a small town in the south of France with his mistress. He stopped at a cafe. He picked up a newspaper and he read about the death of his daughter and her husband in a column of provincial news, alongside notices of crop pieces and church meetings. He sat at a cafe for several hours. He could not move, he could not speak, he could not weep. When he finally stood up, something inside him had changed. He did not write a single poem for 3 years. When he finally wrote again, the first thing he wrote was about her. But the man who emerged from that grief was not the same man who had walked into the cafe. He had begun slowly and without anyone yet noticing to come apart. Within 10 years, he would be locked in a house on a remote island, talking to the dead. And the dead, he believed, were answering. 51, Hugo was forced into political exile. He had spoken against Napoleon III. He had to leave France or be imprisoned. He left to Belgium, then to the Channel Islands, first Jersey, then Guernsey, small rocks in the sea between France and England. He would not return to France for 19 years. He lived in Jersey in a tall, narrow house called Howdewell House. He decorated it himself, room by room, in style so eccentric that visitors today still describe house as a kind of mind made into architecture. Mirrors angled to catch impossible reflections, furniture carved by his own hands, symbols he had invented and never explained. And in this house, in 1850s, Victor Hugo began conducting séances, hundreds of them. A small group would gather around a wooden table. A medium would place her hands on the surface. Hugo would ask questions into the air. The table would tap. It tapped out messages in code, in rhythm, in sentences. According to Hugo's own meticulous transcripts, which survived and which filled several published volumes, he received messages from William Shakespeare, from Mozart, from Galileo, from Jesus Christ, from the Prophet Muhammad, from Plato, from death itself, which Hugo addressed politely as Madame la Mort, and from his dead daughter, Leopoldine. He believed every word, he took notes, he published some of them. Some scholars believe these years on Guernsey were a slow descent into something close to madness. Others argue Hugo knew it was theater and chose to perform it anyway, either reading in his dark, either he was a man who had lost his mind from grief, or he was a man who lied to himself about whether his daughter was speaking from beyond the grave, because the alternative was unbearable. Forse non c'è differenza. Perhaps there is no difference. He continued these seances for years. He stopped only when one of the participants, a young man called Jules Alex, suffered a complete psychiatric breakdown during a session. Alex was committed to an asylum. He never fully recovered. The tables fell, silence after that. But the dead, in Hugo's writing, never stopped speaking. And while he was holding séances on his island in exile, while he was writing transcripts of conversations with Shakespeare and Christ and his drowned daughter, there was living a woman waiting for him in a small house a few hundred meters away. She had been waiting for 20 years. She would wait for 30 more. All of this was happening, the grief, the exile, the dead speaking through tables. Hugo was conducting another life entirely. He had a wife, Adele, the mother of his children. She lived in the same house as him for most of the marriage through. By 1830s, the marriage was effectively over. She took her own lover, a critic named Saint-Pierre, who had been Hugo's friend. Hugo took on many other women. In 1833, he met an actress named Juliette Duret. She was 26, he was 31. She was beautiful, she was ambitious, she had a child from a previous relationship in considerable debt. Hugo bought her debt. He paid off her creditors, he gave her a small apartment, and then slowly, methodically, over the following decade, he took her life away from her. She could not see her old friends. He chose who she met. She could not perform on stage anymore. He forbade it. She could not wear clothes he had not approved. She could not leave the house without his permission. She kept a daily record of her movements, which she submitted to him for review. She became his copyist. Every manuscript he wrote, she copied out by hand. Notre Dame, the Paris, Les Misérables, Tailors of the Sea, all copied in their entirety in her handwriting. She made no money from this work. She owned nothing of her own. When Hugo was exiled to Jersey, she followed him. He set her up in a small house, a short walk from his own, close enough that he could visit, far enough that his wife would not have to see her. She lived there for 23 years. She wrote him letters every day for 50 years. When the historians eventually counted them, they found more than 22,000 letters from Juliette Duret to Victor Hugo. She called him Mon Victor. She called him Mon Dieu. She called him my master. She wrote that her purpose on earth was to serve him. She wrote that she had no will, no desires, no existence apart from his. Some historians read it as the greatest love story in French literary history. Others read it as something else, a woman whose debts had been bought, a woman who had been removed from her profession, her friends, her social circle, a woman who lived in a house chosen by a man she could not legally marry, a woman who copied his manuscripts for free for half a century while he slept with hundreds of other women and recorded them in coded diaries she was not allowed to read. She died in 1883. Hugo had her buried in the cemetery near his summer home. He died 2 years later. He did not name her in his will, but Juliette was only one woman. The diaries Hugo kept locked in his desk, the ones he had been writing for 50 years in 3 languages and his own private code, told a much larger story. The historians would not understand the scale of it until decades after he was buried. He kept diaries, hundreds of them, After his death, when scholars eventually unsealed them, they found a parallel record of his life coded in a mixture of Spanish, Latin, and shorthand he had invented himself. Each entry recorded a sexual encounter, the date, the woman's name or initials, sometimes a price paid, sometimes a brief notation of the act itself. The encounters numbered in the hundreds. They included his servants. They included the wives of his friends. They included women he met on the street. They included, in his old age, women young enough to be his granddaughter. They continued into his 80s. The final entry was made on the day he died. He was 83 years old. He had a stroke that morning. The diary records a sexual encounter shortly before the stroke. He died on May 22nd, 1885. What happened next has no equivalent in modern memory. 2 million people came to his funeral. The entire population of Paris at the time was barely 2 million. People came from across France, across Europe, across the Atlantic. They lined the streets for the procession. They climbed on rooftops. They climbed on each other. By order of the French government, every theater in Paris was closed for the day. Every school was closed. Every public building was draped in black. His coffin, by his own instruction, was a pauper's coffin. Plain pine, no decoration. He had asked to be buried as one of the wretched he had written about. The historians record that the prostitutes of Paris reportedly offered themselves for free on the day of his funeral in tribute to a man they considered their patron. The story may be apocryphal. It is also entirely in character for the man it describes. He was carried to the Pantheon. He lies there still, beside Voltaire and Rousseau, beside the philosophical giants of the French Enlightenment, the greatest novelist of the 19th century, the voice of the poor, the defender of the wretched, the man who wrote Les Misérables, the man who wrote Quasimodo. There is a question the historians cannot answer. Victor Hugo wrote Notre Dame de Paris when he sat in his rooms in Paris in 1830 and imagined a deformed bell ringer locked in a tower, watching from a distance the woman he loved and could never have. Which character was he? Was he Quasimodo, the deformed soul who wanted to be loved and could not be? The man whose grief over his daughter would later break him. The man who spent his evenings asking dead people if they could hear him. Or was he Frollo, the archdeacon, the man of power who saw a beautiful woman and decided she would be his, the man who controlled, who watched, who locked away? He was both. He was probably of Notre Dame, the man whose real name was lost, never knew that he had been watched, never knew that a young writer was committing him to memory, never knew that his deformed back would become one of the most enduring images in the literature of the world. He died and was forgotten, a nickname in a diary in an attic in Cornwall, and the man who watched him became immortal. That is the asymmetry of art, the asymmetry of fame, the asymmetry of who gets remembered and who does not. Victor Hugo's portrait hangs in the Pantheon. The man he called Quasimodo has no portrait, no grave we can find, no name we know. He lies somewhere under Paris, in an unmarked stretch of soil. Beneath the city, he carved gargoyles to protect. And every time a child asks who Quasimodo was, and every time a tourist looks up at Notre Dame and sees a stone figure looking back, they are remembering the wrong man. The man who wrote Quasimodo was not Quasimodo. He was something else entirely.